Don't let the mainstream narrative fool you. At Karoline Now, we peel back the layers of political theater to reveal the raw conflict shaping America. Like, subscribe, and join the conversation below as Cal Morgan breaks down the cultural battlegrounds where truth and power collide. The fluorescent lights of Hollywood's entertainment machine flickered overhead as Clint Eastwood's town car pulled to the curb outside Jimmy Kimmel Live. At 94, Eastwood moved with the deliberate precision of a man who'd outlived both friends and enemies. A living monument to an era when Hollywood stood for something beyond viral clips and manufactured outrage. As he entered the studio, conversations hushed. His 6 feet 4 inches frame, though now slightly stooped with age, commanded a reverence that no algorithm could quantify. This wasn't merely a guest arrival, this was the last titan of truth stepping into the coliseum of contemporary entertainment. Mr. Eastwood is here to discuss his film, period. Maggie, his formidable assistant of 20 years, informed the production team with steel in her voice. He's not here for your circus tricks or internet stunts. Her eyes locked with Sarah, the show's coordinator, whose reputation for manufacturing viral moments preceded her. Sarah nodded respectfully while her mind calculated angles and segments. Of course we're honored to have him, she replied, already drafting text messages to her team. Old man goldmine, let's make this one pop. Backstage, Kimmel paced nervously, running through his opening monologue. At 56, he'd built an empire on celebrity interviews and politically charged comedy that resonated with the coastal audience demographics. But Eastwood represented something entirely different, a generation that spoke plainly, that didn't perform emotion for likes or shares. He's just another guest, Jimmy, his wife Molly reassured him, adjusting his tie. You've interviewed presidents. Presidents need approval, Kimmel muttered. Eastwood stopped caring what anyone thought sometime around 1975. In the green room, Eastwood sat alone, reviewing notes about his latest film. A taut narrative about a retired judge who discovers corruption in the very system he once served. The parallels weren't subtle. Hollywood, like America itself, had become something Eastwood barely recognized, a place where substance surrendered daily to spectacle. The makeup artist approached timidly. Mr. Eastwood, just a light touch-up before we go on? He nodded, those famous narrowed eyes taking her measure. Just don't make me look like one of those filtered Instagram people, he said, his voice a graveled whisper that carried the weight of the Mojave Desert. Through the monitors, Eastwood watched as Kimmel warmed up the audience, cracking jokes about politicians and celebrities, all carefully calibrated to offend just enough without crossing lines that might jeopardize sponsorships. It was everything Eastwood despised, calculated, sanitized rebellion packaged for consumption. He wasn't here for this game. He was here for the film, for the story that needed telling. And as the floor director counted down to his introduction, something shifted in the atmosphere. The calm before a storm, the silence before the gunshot. Two visions of America were about to collide on national television. Entertainment versus truth, spectacle versus substance, the ephemeral versus the enduring. The applause sign flashed. The audience roared. And Clint Eastwood, the last guardian of Hollywood's frontier spirit, rose to meet whatever came next, unscripted, unfiltered, and utterly uncompromising. The studio audience erupted as Eastwood emerged from behind the curtain, his weathered silhouette cutting through the artificial fog like a specter from America's cultural memory. At 94, he moved with the deliberate economy of a man who'd conserved his energy for battles that mattered, each step a calculated statement against the frantic pace of modern entertainment. Kimmel bounded toward him with the manufactured enthusiasm that had become the trademark of late-night television, all bright smiles and extravagant gestures designed to create the illusion of intimacy where none existed. Ladies and gentlemen, the legendary Clint Eastwood. Kimmel's voice cracked slightly, betraying the nervousness beneath his professional veneer. Their handshake told the story before words could. Eastwood's grip firm and unyielding, a relic of an era when a handshake still meant something. Kimmel visibly flinched, his eyes widening at the unexpected strength from those weathered fingers. From the production booth, Sarah watched with predatory focus. Zoom in on that handshake tension, she whispered into her headset. That's our first clip right there. As they settled into the interview chairs, separated by 3 feet of space that somehow felt like a chasm, the temperature in the room shifted. This wasn't the choreographed dance of celebrity promotion. This was two Americas facing off across a divide, deeper than politics. So, Clint, this new film of yours really tackles some heavy themes about justice. Kimmel began, his note cards trembling slightly. Eastwood leaned forward, his voice a controlled rumble that commanded attention without demanding it. It's about truth, Jimmy. Something that's in short supply these days. We've got an industry making pictures for money rather than meaning. That's not filmmaking. That's commerce. Sarah's eyes lit up in the control room. We're trending already, she mouthed excitedly. Kimmel, sensing the weight pressing down on his carefully constructed format, attempted to pivot. Well, you've certainly played your share of cowboys who stood for truth. Remember when you told that bad guy to… That was acting, Eastwood interrupted, his face hardening into the granite expression that had stared down countless villains. This is real life, there's a difference. Maybe that line gets blurred too often these days. The studio grew uncomfortably quiet, the audience uncertain whether to laugh or hold their breath, as Eastwood methodically dismantled the scaffolding of late-night entertainment with each precise response. Your show, Eastwood continued, each word a deliberate jab at the foundation of Kimmel's empire. What exactly is it contributing, besides distraction? Kimmel's practiced composure began to crack, beads of sweat forming at his temples despite the chilled studio air. Entertainment has value, Clint. We help people laugh after hard days. At what cost? Eastwood countered, his eyes narrowing. Got any truth to tell on this stage? That question hung in the air, unanswerable and damning, a challenge not just to Kimmel, but to an entire system built on spectacle without substance. In the silence that followed, America's cultural divide was no longer an abstraction, but a tangible presence, embodied in two men separated by more than just generations. The studio air crackled with tension, as two visions of America squared off under the hot lights. What had begun as a standard late-night interview had transformed into something far more consequential, a generational standoff between entertainment and authenticity, between metrics and meaning. Kimmel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the practiced ease of his professional demeanor giving way to something more primal, survival instinct. He reached for the weapons he knew best: numbers, validation, proof of relevance. We reach 10 million viewers weekly, he offered, his voice straining for authority. The biggest blockbusters you criticize, they connect with audiences across political divides. Isn't that worth something? Eastwood remained still, unmoved by the arithmetic of influence. His weathered face, a landscape carved by decades of standing his ground, betrayed nothing as he delivered his response with quiet devastation. You make a show to help audiences forget the truth, not face it, he declared, each word landing like a bullet fired from one of his iconic film revolvers. The audience fractured visibly, some erupting in supportive applause for Eastwood's uncompromising stance, others laughing nervously, seeking refuge in the comfort of humor. The division among them mirrored the wider cultural fissures running through the American consciousness. From the production booth, Sarah frantically signaled for camera adjustments. Get that split reaction shot, she hissed into her headset. This is going viral in real time. Kimmel, sensing the ground shifting beneath him, tried to regain control with a strategic pivot. Let's talk about Dirty Harry, a commercial juggernaut that broke box office records. Wasn't that entertainment? The trap was laid, but Eastwood had been navigating media ambushes since before Kimmel was born. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a register that forced everyone to lean in. Those films were about justice, Jimmy, not entertainment. They asked questions that needed asking. The box office was a consequence, not the goal. Maggie watched from the wings, a protective vigilance in her eyes. She'd seen this dance before, producers attempting to reduce her boss to a caricature, only to discover the man behind the icon was far more formidable than his silver screen personas. With each exchange, blood was drawn. Kimmel's practiced smile, a professional tool honed through thousands of interviews, began disintegrating at the edges. The corners of his mouth twitched downward against his will, the mask of congenial host slipping to reveal the wounded performer beneath. Eastwood maintained his stoic demeanor, economy of movement matching his economy of words. He hadn't raised his voice once, yet somehow his presence had expanded to fill every corner of the studio. This wasn't loud confrontation. This was the quiet authority that had defined American masculinity for generations. Patient, uncompromising, certain. I've been making pictures for 60 years, Eastwood continued. And in all that time, the only thing that's mattered is what remains after the cameras stop rolling. Will people remember something true? Or just something loud? Kimmel swallowed hard, caught between professional obligation and personal affront. Behind him, through the glass partition, his wife Molly watched with concern. witnessing her husband's carefully constructed world being methodically dismantled by a man who had transcended celebrity to become something closer to monument. The verbal warfare continued, neither man willing to concede ground in a battle that had become about far more than promoting a film or generating clips. This had become a referendum on American culture itself, substance versus spectacle, conviction versus convenience, truth versus comfort. And as the commercial break approached, the only certainty was that there would be no winners, only survivors. The battlefield of ideas had shifted. Kimmel, no longer the comfortable ringmaster of his own circus, rose shakily to his feet. It was a move that betrayed everything about his position. Hosts remained seated, in control. Standing was the desperate gambit of a man losing ground. His voice, normally calibrated for punchlines, fractured under the weight of genuine emotion. "Do you have any idea what we've built here?" Kimmel demanded, gesturing wildly at the studio around them. "The millions we've raised for children's hospitals? The platform we've created for voices that wouldn't be heard?" But justifications, however noble, only underscored his defensive position. The audience sensed it. Eastwood knew it. This wasn't about charity work or audience connections, it was about the fundamental currency of respect. Eastwood's response came not as shouting, but as the quiet finality of judgment. "I came here to talk about this film, but you want me to play clown for your 2 million online views. I don't play that game." 5 decades of cinematic gravitas resided in those words. The studio audience, previously caught between loyalties, found their collective voice. Applause erupted. Not the polite, prompted kind that punctuated commercial breaks, but something organic, something real. Some began chanting Eastwood's name, a rallying cry that echoed through the soundstage. From the production booth, Sarah watched in horror as metrics and social engagements, the modern measurements of success, became suddenly irrelevant. This wasn't content, this was consequence. Kimmel stood motionless, absorbing the public rejection. The color drained from his face as his audience, his people, abandoned him for Eastwood's uncompromising authenticity. Entertainment had collided with truth, and truth had proven the immovable object. "Let's take a break," Kimmel managed, the words barely audible over the continuing applause. The professional smile he attempted looked like something from a wax museum, the shape correct, but devoid of life. His eyes, windows to a suddenly uncertain future, reflected nothing but vacancy. In the wings, Molly pressed a hand to her mouth, witnessing her husband's public dismantling with the special agony reserved for loving witnesses to catastrophe. Across the stage, Maggie nodded almost imperceptibly, a general acknowledging a battle well fought. The most telling moment came next. Kimmel turned, not toward his desk where hosts traditionally waited out commercial breaks, but toward the exit. His steps were mechanical, each one carrying him further from the center of his own kingdom. The cameras, programmed to follow action, tracked his retreat instinctively, capturing what network executives would later describe as unprecedented in broadcast history. Eastwood remained seated, immobile as Mount Rushmore. He hadn't come to destroy a man or a show, he had simply refused to participate in his own diminishment. At 94, he had nothing to prove and nothing to lose, the most dangerous combination in American cultural warfare. As the on-air light blinked to commercial, a singular truth hung in the studio. Power in modern America resided not with those who controlled platforms, but with those who maintained conviction when those platforms demanded compromise. The battle had ended. No white flag was raised, but one man remained standing, ironically, the one who never left his chair. The digital wildfire spread with unprecedented speed. Within moments of Kimmel's retreat, the confrontation between Hollywood legend and late-night host transformed from televised moment to cultural phenomenon. Smartphones across America lit up with notifications, each ping marking another front in the escalating war for American entertainment's soul. A 30-second clip of Eastwood's unflinching declaration, "I don't play that game," rocketed through social media's neural network, accumulating 2.5 million views in 60 minutes. The hashtags told their own story. Hashtag Eastwood vs Kimmel. Hashtag TruthWins. Hashtag RealityCheck. As dawn broke over Los Angeles, the celebrity world fractured along ideological fault lines. Jimmy Fallon attempted to diffuse the tension with carefully calibrated humor that landed with all the impact of a feather on cement. Conan O'Brien rallied to his fellow host's defense, calling it, quote, an unfortunate misunderstanding between two American icons. But industry titan Martin Scorsese cut through the diplomatic noise. Clint spoke what Hollywood needs to hear, what we've forgotten in our rush for clicks and views. In the Kimmel household, the aftermath played out in painful privacy. Molly watched her husband pace their living room until 4 a.m., his phone buzzing with messages from network executives whose concern for his well-being extended precisely as far as their concern for advertising revenue. "They're saying the show dropped 20% in overnight numbers," Kimmel whispered, the metrics that once validated his existence now pronouncing judgment. Meanwhile, across town, Maggie fielded calls from theater chains reporting unexpected surges in pre-sales for Eastwood's upcoming film. "People want to see the man who stood his ground," she explained to the director as he sipped morning coffee, unmoved by the digital tempest swirling around his name. "I didn't do anything special," Eastwood replied, the morning light catching the contours of a face weathered by 9 decades of American history. "I just didn't do what I didn't want to do." The media-industrial complex mobilized with mechanical efficiency. Variety published an analysis before trading opened on Wall Street. Eastwood-Kimmel confrontation symbolizes entertainment's civil war. BuzzFeed followed with 10 moments when Clint Eastwood exposed Hollywood's authenticity problem. Cable news panels assembled experts to dissect every facial expression, every word, every implied meaning. At the studio, Sarah huddled with production staff reviewing the catastrophic metrics. Social engagement had skyrocketed, but in precisely the wrong direction. Comments flooded in. "Finally someone real. This is why I stopped watching these shows years ago. Eastwood for president. We need to issue a statement," an executive insisted during an emergency Zoom. "Frame this as a dialogue about entertainment's evolution." But how do you reframe authenticity versus manipulation? Truth versus packaging? The battle lines weren't drawn between two men, but between competing visions of American culture itself. By nightfall, the incident had transcended entertainment news to become something more fundamental, a referendum on values in a nation increasingly suspicious of packaged narratives. Kimmel's audience had voted with their viewership, Eastwood's with their wallets, and America with its divided attention. In the green room of a competing network where Eastwood had agreed to a single interview, Maggie reviewed talking points with her boss of 30 years. "You don't need to mention Kimmel directly," she advised. "This can be about larger principles." Eastwood nodded, adjusting his tie with hands that had directed Oscar-winning films and shaped American mythology for half a century. It always was. The confrontation that began on a brightly lit stage had expanded into a national conversation about authenticity in an age of algorithms. As America chose sides, the only certainty was that in the collision between manufactured consent and unvarnished conviction, there could be no true compromise, only temporary truces in an ongoing cultural civil war. In their separate sanctuaries, two men faced the aftermath of collision, one crumbling under public scrutiny, the other standing unmoved in its wake. The digital storm that began on Kimmel's stage had transformed into a cultural hurricane, leaving both men to confront not just each other, but the very foundations of their existence. In his Brentwood mansion, Jimmy Kimmel sat alone in blue light, his face illuminated by an endless scroll of public judgment. Each tweet, each comment, each analysis of his humiliation arrived like a digital dagger. The metrics that once validated his existence now chronicled his undoing. Viewership in freefall. Social sentiment overwhelmingly negative. Celebrity allies suddenly silent. "I lost everything in one night. How do I stand when the world saw me fall?" he whispered to the empty room, the words hanging unanswered in the midnight air. For 20 years, he had built an empire on calibrated laughter, on the careful curation of moments designed to go viral. Now, in one unscripted exchange, that empire revealed its foundations of sand. His phone buzzed, Molly, texting from upstairs. "This will pass. People have short memories." But Kimmel knew better. In America's attention economy, some moments don't fade. They crystallize into cultural touchstones. His fingers hovered over the screen, unable to articulate the hollowness spreading through his chest. For the first time in decades, the man who made his fortune with words found himself speechless. Across Los Angeles, in a sparse office decorated only with film awards and vintage Western photography, Clint Eastwood sat reviewing footage from his upcoming film. The 94-year-old director's weathered face revealed nothing as Maggie burst through the door, tablet in hand. "You're everywhere, boss. You're trending higher than the president. They're calling you the last honest man in Hollywood. The clips have 50 million views already." Eastwood didn't look up from his work. "No need. The film speaks for me." Maggie paused, studying the man she'd protected from publicity vultures for 3 decades. "Don't you want to see what they're saying?" "Why would I start caring about that now?" he responded, his focus unwavering as he studied the frame composition on his monitor. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. While Kimmel refreshed his feeds obsessively, seeking salvation in the court of public opinion, Eastwood remained untethered from the validation machine that had consumed his younger counterpart. One man's identity dissolved without external affirmation, the others remained impervious to it. By morning, network executives had assembled an emergency strategy session. Sarah, the show coordinator who had orchestrated the ill-fated segment, sat stone-faced as ratings graphs trended downward on the conference room screen. "We need to get ahead of this narrative," insisted a vice president in New York, his voice crackling through speakers. "Schedule sympathetic guests. Frame this as Eastwood being out of touch with modern entertainment." But the metrics told a different story. Younger viewers, the demographic that advertisers coveted most, were abandoning the show in droves, many publicly declaring their newfound respect for a 94-year-old director they'd previously ignored. In the cultural battlefield of American entertainment, authenticity had launched a surprise offensive against artifice, and the casualties were mounting. Kimmel represented entertainment that had grown increasingly hollow. Eastwood embodied conviction that remained unyielding. One man questioned his entire career path while drowning in digital noise. The other continued creating, oblivious to the storm he'd unleashed. What neither fully grasped was that their collision had transcended personal conflict to become a referendum on American culture itself. In a landscape where truth had become malleable and sincerity manufactured, their confrontation offered something increasingly rare, a genuine moment between two men representing competing visions of what entertainment should be. As evening fell on Los Angeles, Molly finally convinced Kimmel to disconnect from his phone. "This doesn't define you," she insisted, taking his hand. But her words rang hollow in the silence that followed. They both knew that in America's unforgiving cultural arena, sometimes a single moment of revelation could indeed define everything that followed. The question remaining was whether Kimmel would rebuild by embracing the very authenticity that Eastwood had demanded, or retreat further into the comfort of scripted interactions and manufactured moments. Meanwhile, Eastwood finished his day's work and drove home along Mulholland Drive, as sunset painted the city gold. For him, tomorrow would be identical to today, another day of creating stories that reflected his unwavering vision, regardless of who applauded or who criticized. In this tale of two men, America glimpsed its own divided soul, caught between craving authenticity and settling for its simulation. The reckoning had only just begun. In America's cultural battlegrounds, true power comes not from viral moments or audience metrics, but from unwavering conviction. While Kimmel clung to viewership numbers and celebrity approval, Eastwood stood resolute in his belief that truth transcends entertainment. The media landscape magnifies conflicts but rarely resolves them. At 94, Eastwood demonstrates that true cultural impact comes from standing firm when others bend. A reminder that in the war between authenticity and appeasement, those who remain true to their principles ultimately write their own legacy.